So today we have Dr. Priyanka Ravi. She is a neuropsychologist and she's also a burnout specialist. And she will be speaking on the symptoms of burnout in educators. And we all know as educators that burnout happens to all of us. And it is how to create balance for your mental health. Without any further ado, I'd like to turn over to you at this time, Dr. Ravi, and we're looking forward to a wonderful time here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. It's so nice to meet you, Dr. Noel, and of course,
Pleasure.
Dr. Dwayne. And it's a pleasure to have this, workshop today, this session today on burnout for educators. So, shall we get started? Excellent. So, firstly, welcome to everyone. I appreciate that you all are working, and it must be a very long day for you. It's Thursday morning here for me, but still, after a long day, you all have tuned in and are interested to find out more about burnout, especially in educators. So let's get straight to it. So, firstly, I just want to begin with sort of my take on burnout. Now, when I say my take, what's different? Normally, when we speak about burnout, like Dr. Noel said, everybody says, oh, burnout. Yes, I feel that. I've experienced it, and people can relate to that. But that's only the surface. What I have found certainly with burnout today, given how chaotic and stressful the work life is, how much we have to balance everything. It's like, you have two hands and you have to do 20 things in 5 minutes, that kind of a pressure. So burnout is no longer individual. The World Health Organization already has defined this, that burnout is not a reflection of the individual's capability or capacity, but somehow people are still sort of in that mode of looking at burnout more as a symptom that I feel burnt out rather than understanding the mechanics. Especially, I feel that there's a difference between how intense burnout is amongst different people in working professions. So I started focusing more on burnout because throughout the pandemic and mostly even after the pandemic around 2022 and 23, I had way too many people coming towards me saying that, look, I'm experiencing a lot of challenges with my mental health. So whether it's anxiety, whether it's depression, low mood, um, eating disorders. And when I started sort of helping these people out and investigating, it was almost common amongst all of them that they had work that was challenging. They were in very challenging jobs. They were in very challenging professions and industries that really required them to maintain performance. But the issue why this is so common is we have kind of inherited a backlog from the pandemic. There were a lot of situations where schools, hospitals, justice system could not adapt, and there was a backlog, right? So out of the pandemic around 2022, 23, a lot of people were experiencing burnout from backlog. And of course, the challenges that were there with social distancing, not being able to see your friends and family, so it was a little bit lonely, not getting stimulated, all of those actually accumulated. Now, coming off the bat of that, a lot of things have changed when AI has arrived in the scene. And now, globally, when we're looking at how things are actually done or how logistics works, it increased a lot of pressure amongst people. So what we're experiencing now more commonly is, yes, people, more and more people are feeling individual burnout, saying that, I feel very burnt out after I finish my week at work. And these are people who have been working for 20, 30, 40 odd years of life, including the younger generation as well now, experiencing burnout when they leave school and go to high school, or when they go from high school to university, or even when they go and complete their undergraduate in university and move into the workforce. So this isn't something where you can say it's only a specific group of people or only, management level or leadership that are experiencing it. From my experience, almost everybody, no matter where they're coming from, what their designation or their role is, has experienced challenges with burnout. And the issue here is that we are not, as human beings, designed to work at such high pressure under a lot of stress for a very long period of time. And that's the trick, because we are sort of biologically wired to deal with stress. So there's something called the fight or flight phenomenon. Basically, our body generates a lot of cortisol, and cortisol is very important for us because cortisol helps us stay alert. Helps us stay aware. It actually helps us regulate things like our mood, our digestion. It helps us sleep, or sells, the signal to the brain saying that, okay, now's the time to switch off and go to sleep. It actually works very well with our circadian rhythm as well. So our whole programming actually is, to a large extent, tied down to this little thing called cortisol. Now, when we are stressed for a very long time, what starts to happen is cortisol, when it's active in the body and it's released, it's actually telling the body, hey, look, you got to do a bit more work here. You got to hurry up and you got to use a lot more energy, right? So the body starts working really, really hard because the increased amount of cortisol in the body is telling the body that, okay, you got to focus, you got to concentrate, you got to be really, really alert. So you're sort of a little bit hypervigilant, if you can say, more sensitive to sounds, noises. That really has an effect on the mood. But it's also telling the body that, all the other things that the body was doing, like maintaining the body, making sure that dead cells are being repaired, that slows down. Whatever regeneration work the body was doing in terms of preparing new cells, healthy cells, all of that goes down. The DNA repair that's happening goes down. And of course, mentally or cognitively, when there's too much cortisol in the brain, at that point, your brain is not engaged in any other activity that is requiring too much energy, because your body knows that you're in survival mode, in fighting mode, right? Now, in human beings, what this means is your body will stop doing complex tasks like decision making, analysis, rationalizing things, paying a lot of attention to detail at that moment. So it makes sense out in the wilderness when we sort of had this adaptation where, we're moving through the jungle and there might be predators and all of that, where cortisol, when it was released, it actually helped us as a survival adaptation, made us alert. But in modern setups, what we're finding is it's not related to a incident to a predator where you have to save your life and effectively, fight or flight. And now we're seeing more of the freeze, coming through as a third element, because when the stressor isn't a temporary thing, it's not a predator that, you just encountered on the way, it's chronic. So the stress, when we're talking about stress in the workplace or in the students, it's long term. It's not like, you got a jump scare because there was a tiger that you saw, but then it went the other way, or you left the place and then you exited, right? Because when you exit that situation, or that threat is removed, your cortisol comes down, right? Your cortisol comes down, and when your cortisol is there, that's something called the sympathetic nervous system in the body, that the brain activates to take care of making sure that you're ready to protect yourself. That's why you go into survival mode. So when that comes down, you go into the parasympathetic mode, which is the mode that calms you down. It makes sure that you are processing your energy and your water really well, so your kidneys are working again properly, your fat is being decomposed properly and breaking down, the nutrients is absorbed properly again, so your intestines are working, your gut health improves, your immunity improves, because all of your system has come back and said, right, we're not dealing with an emergency anymore. Let's get back to work. Now, when you're sort of in a profession where there's a lot of stress, or even in life, some event might have happened and that stress isn't contained anymore. It's not just a few days, it's not a few weeks, it's long term, more like a stressful environment, or just the pressure of performing at a very high level. What this is doing to people is it's putting them on a permanent sort of survival mode. Okay. And when that happens, um, a lot of things start going wrong. And we can see that now in terms of performance. So, with educators such as yourself, there's two things I really, really want you to be aware of is one, how your body works when you are burnt out, and also how you can identify burnout in your students, because I have come through so many educators who are telling us that, we're really working hard to help the children learn, and that is so important, when children are in school, that they're able to concentrate, they're able to learn. But educators are finding it difficult to teach and get children to achieve the understanding academically because the children are also stressed. So today, I'm hoping I can share a few things with you and also explain to you the mechanics of how stress works in your body so that in the classroom, you can have a better idea of when you're being stressful. And then when you're away from the classroom, when you're away from teaching, you can actually make sure that you have more conscious interventions, especially like, around exam time or when you have a lot of marking to do, the stress levels can seriously go very, very high. And I'm sure with educators around the world, the pressure right now is actually coming from things changing. With AI, there's so many things that teachers have to make sure that there's no plagiarism, that the children are not copy pasting things, and they're asking questions that, I read something on Wikipedia and Google or ChatGPT told me that this works in this way. Can you tell me? And you're like, oh, how many things, you're a human being, not a memory chip. So it can be very, very overwhelming, especially around exam time, because you have to make sure you get the marking and set up the papers and everything really, really well. So whenever you're really required by design for your profession, for your role, to really think critically, put in a lot of effort, attention, we find that under pressure, especially if there's deadlines and timelines to meet, performance is very, very central, that stress can actually lead to chronic burnout. And again, here the trick I said was that when you understand how burnout works mechanically, the biology of it, then you can kind of step back and create a recovery period. Because one thing that has happened with work and stressful life is that we're not able to get into recovery mode. So a lot of times I will have people who are working professionals and they might have, one project that was very, very important and the deadline had to come through. They must have been working on it for 3 months. And then as soon as they finish that, it's not like that they're going to get another 3 months to go on a holiday, relax. They might be getting a few weeks of silence, a few weeks of quiet, but it's very rare normally what is happening now, especially as educators, that you keep pushing until the next, until the next, until the next, the next assignment, the next project work that is due, the next excursion that needs to happen, marking. So the intervals between, when you're overstimulated with stress and there's too much cortisol in your body versus you actually getting off that is very, very narrow now. So we're actually not having a lot of recovery period. So I hope you'll be able to understand burnout now from the biological perspective, particularly, and take care of yourself in that sense when you have very extensive, I guess, blocks in your calendar where you know that you will be required to perform, where you know that you will be required to do a lot of complex thinking, a lot of tasks. Then maybe you can manage yourself a little bit better by saying that, okay, if my schedule around May and June is looking very hectic, then I'm not going to pick up anything extra at that time because you don't want to overstimulate yourself. And on the contrary, you might want to make more regular intervals in that phase, that last month where you might spend maybe 1 hour every day during the weekend because you only get 2 days, at least to kind of make sure that you have more self-care in there so that your body can actually switch off from survival mode and come into that parasympathetic system. Because a lot of the diseases that we're now getting, are actually linked to burnout. So it's not as simple as people now discovering that they are having diabetes or have a tension, cardiovascular diseases because of diet or lifestyle alone. It's actually got to do with the fact that they have been burnt out very chronically the last year, 2 years, and it's been so intense that their system has, really said, look, I'm sending out red flags because you've put me into survival mode for too long. We've not been designed to uh, to be in survival mode or to function in survival mode for, I would say, less than a couple of minutes, because, like I said, biologically, when we inherited this mechanism, it was only to deal with time bound stimulators, whether it's a predator in the jungle or a different human that you have encountered and that kind of stuff, which is, a couple of minutes. If I really had to put a number on it, you would say 10-15 minutes of you being under stress, or kind of like, when you go to a theme park and you know that, oh, I don't really like going on the roller coaster, but you will be stressed out. And for the experience of it, if the roller coaster is going to last 5 minutes, you know that you're going to be very anxious. You're going to be very frightened. But then once that you're off that ride, you'd have experienced it and you'd get that, cooling off period. With stress, we're finding that with the working people, that's not the case anymore, because it's not 5 minutes of being very, very stimulated with cortisol and stress. It's actually got to do with, the whole work week. And a lot of the issues actually are now coming because you're not just working at work, your work is actually coming home with you. So you're not finishing on time, the boundaries are a little bit maybe wishy-washy, or you might have to go into extra time, like with educators all the time. Before the year ends, you have to finish your marking, so you have to work at home as well. So your me time isn't actually really me time anymore. And those are the things, because you're not getting that recovery period, because you're not getting time to switch off and de-escalate from that mode, that's leading to burnout in educators. And why this is really important is we need cortisol to learn, right? And I'll explain that in a bit. But when we are stuck in survival mode for a very long time and your sympathetic nervous system is too active for a very long period, it doesn't switch off. So, what this means is there's a risk that you might make mistakes. You might not be paying attention to what your friends and family are telling you, what the students are telling you. Sometimes the things would be really, really obvious, and you'd find that because you're so overwhelmed and you're burnt out, you just didn't pick it up. And that's when the real problem starts, because people start struggling. They're not attuned to picking up normal cues that they would have if they had the rest and the recovery that's part of a normal cycle.
Dr.
Now,
Ravi, hold on one
yes,
second. Are you sharing your screen?
I will soon.
Oh, you was okay. I thought you were sharing. Okay.
Yes.
All right,
So,
continue. You can continue.
excellent. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Can everyone see?
Yes.
Excellent. So what I do with my work with burnout is, of course, I focus a lot with educators, from doctors and nurses, from lawyers, different organizations, governments even, to deal with burnout in their teams, whether it's leadership, because leadership always have something called decision fatigue. They're not able to understand what's happening at the bottom, and they sometimes take a different route in terms of executing things. So there's always issues around decision fatigue, making sure that there's a decision latency, or the fact that, in very large organizations, the management or the senior leadership might have to wait for internal alignment. But what this means is you are dragging things out, your pressure is building and it's mounting, and your performance goes down, and actually your organization or your job isn't very, done very well, and your performance actually goes down. So I do something called Burnout to Brilliance, where I work with people at an individual level and also an organizational level to make sure, especially that organizations are working in a way that actually allows people to get stimulated from stress if they're required to do something. But at the same time, you're not always stuck in firefighting and survival mode. So it's very important, when you're running an organization, especially with educators, that yes, your teachers are working very, very hard and they're stimulated, but we want to make sure that once they have finished, their examinations or setting the exam, marking it, and all of that, in between that, we're not giving them extra work. So making sure that it's all aligned with biology, that's when people can actually really perform, and that's when the good teaching happens. That's when the good learning actually happens. So I already explained a little bit about this, the neurobiology of chronic stress and burnout. So we have a lot of cortisol that gets released in the brain, and that actually affects everything else in terms of your other functions. So when cortisol is released, very high amounts of cortisol actually tell the body that, look, we need to stop doing all the other things that the body normally does. So your blood pressure goes up, your immune system gets desensitized, it goes down, so you're more likely to get sick. Your digestive system slows down, so your nutrients can either be, accidentally deleted, or it's just very hard to absorb. So your lifestyle, your diet might be really good, but the fact that you are burnt out and your system is in this firefighting mode for a couple of months or a very long time because you have been dealing with, workplace related burnout, even if there's something in your life that's driving you and causing you to experience burnout, you will find that your gut and your, I guess, mood around eating would change as well. A lot of people feel that when they experience burnout, they get cravings, because your body is telling you that I need a lot of energy because you're always hyperactive. You might not feel that way, but your body is stuck in that system. So their eating patterns change. They might stop the healthy eating as well and drink, eat and drink more food that's more caffeinated. That's a big no-no because you're already, fueling the fire. The cortisol is already making your body work very, very hard. And now you're putting more caffeine in there, or more energy drinks, more sugar. That's a huge sort of burden that you're kind of putting in. You're giving your body extra work to do. And of course, your reward system goes down because when you're in survival mode, you're just too busy fighting things out that you're not able to feel motivated. You're not able to feel emotions very well. So now we're having more and more people who have experienced burnout for a very long time, a couple of months, 6 months to a year, that they are then coming across with, mental health challenges like experiencing depression because of, again, that circuitry in your brain that cortisol has just switched everything off. So they're experiencing depression, specifically, bipolar depression has gone up very much with people who have been burnt out. And also, there's something called anhedonia, which is almost like apathy, if I could put it in more colloquial terms, where you're not able to engage and interpret emotions very well. And that can be very challenging in a social environment because that means if you're working with children or even with adults, that you're not able to engage with or, react to their emotions. So it has a very huge toll on your social life, on your relationships as well. So now that we've experienced or gone through the process of what actually happens with the neurobiology and burnout, why this is really important, and I think it's very important for educators to understand this, is when it's healthy, it's great. When there's a bit of cortisol, you need that. It stimulates you, it helps you respond and come back to your baseline, that restful state. That is really good because that's where the creativity happens. That's when your mind is actually doing the complex things, and you can think about creativity, whether it's in writing, whether it's in drawing, whether it's maths, whatever it may be. But when you're in chronic stress, all of that goes out the window. So very much what the brain does is when you come back into your, short term, which is marked by the green side, that you pretty much allow the brain to go back into doing your normal neurochemical stuff. And that actually helps because when your brain is stimulated, your neurons that form pathways in your brain, those things are actually involved in your learning. So for educators, this is so important because when you're stressed, believe it or not, I'm sure in the classroom, this will go to your children as well. You can call it manifestation, you can call it mirroring, but this has a really big impact for educators because you're constantly under the pump. And if you're not rested, then you will find that during sessions, you might not be able to teach as well, and your children might not be able to learn as well. And vice versa with younger kids now with social media and so many other pressures that they're exposed to. They're always looking for constant validation, but they are, overstimulated. It's not as easy as having a quiet classroom anymore. So we also need to be aware as educators how to look for burnout in students, because if the student is burnt out, no matter how amazing your lesson is going to be, they will not be able to learn as well. So they can develop learning difficulties, especially if they are burnt out much earlier in their, schooling years. It may be for various things, because of family circumstances. It may be because of bullying that's happening in the school that is kind of forcing them to go inwards, but they're constantly feeling burnt out and shy. But what this actually does to their brain is this kind of stops the brain from learning. It stops the brain from forming different neural pathways. And we know that it's this ability for the brain to learn that actually allows you to build on education, to build on knowledge. It's those structures, those neurons are not for a specific thing. They actually develop a network, and that's when you can actually have real knowledge going into the children. So if you want children to really learn well, or for that matter yourself, there's so many changes happening in education now that teachers also need to be updating themselves. So you have to learn very, very quickly, then you have to run and go and teach all your children to make sure that they learn this so that they can put it in their exams, they can perform, they can develop this thinking. So you have to understand that, the nervous system has a very big impact on overall, health, definitely, especially if left unchecked. So you need to make sure that when you are experiencing burnout, there is a recovery period. You give yourself a little bit of a break, or a period where you can hold some boundaries and, be firm with yourself that you're not going to add more burden to yourself, whether it's emotional work, mental labor, you name it, physical labor, and that you're going to focus more on things that can de-stress you, whether it might be taking a walk, doing a little bit of physical activity that you enjoy, playing music or hearing music, things that actually calm you down, that de-stress you, that make you feel a little bit happier, because it at least adds a little bit of a circuit breaker and gives you a break. And that's when, your brain is active, and that's when you can have the release, the reward function comes back, and your ability to learn and actually form deep knowledge structures comes back. So it's very, very important with children so that they can continue learning. We saw during the pandemic how we were not able to deliver lessons and there was no one-on-one in class. So imagine when you don't have that stimulation and you have to learn all by yourself. There's too many gaps. So as it is, recent, generation has had a lot of disruption in their learning. So to top it all off, if they are always burnt out, or if the educator is burnt out, it's going to be very hard for that particular child's brain to actually be able to learn. So it can actually have a very profound impact on that child's life going forward, in terms of their understanding, how well they'll be able to educate themselves, how well they'll be able to work. Because even once you finish your education and you head out into the work, you're constantly learning new things, learning with colleagues, learning for projects, trying to adapt as you keep trying to, go through whatever profession that you have. So to deal with those challenges, your brain actually needs to adapt, and that only happens through learning. So with educators, this is so, so, so important, because once you understand about how you can learn better, and you can also help your children learn really, really well in classroom. So Again, we're trying to aim for the green area where we have stress that resolves. If you are too much into the chronic stress area, that's when we're having issues with sleep, we're having issues with food, we're having issues with your gut health and your immunity. So what this now means is those people who have had long-term exposure to cortisol or stress and burnout, then we're finding that cardiovascular disease is way common. So not only are people developing diseases or diseases manifesting earlier in people now because of their exposure to stress in the nervous system, but also that it's more aggressive and it advances very quickly. So with cardiovascular diseases, it's not a slow progression that what we once thought that we would see in people. Once it starts, it hits people who are much earlier now because they've been burnt out. And also it progresses, it advances very quickly. This is the same with cancers, especially stomach cancers, because your immunity has gone down. Almost all the time, a lot of people who have experienced burnout the last 1 to 2 years and their health starts declining. By the time they actually see a doctor, and the doctor does their treatment or they try and find out, investigate what the problem is with this particular individual, they realize that they have some form of stage 3 cancer, which is, stage 3 is very difficult when that's when things get detected. And this isn't necessarily to do with the fact that, you turned up too late or the intervention happened too late. It's because it progresses very, very fast. Because you can imagine when you're burnt out and your nervous system is not repairing your body and you're not fighting, your immune system is down, your chances of catching diseases and getting sick is very, very high. Now, the trick here is once that happens, behaviorally, when we're stressed, we start masking things like fatigue, like mood swings, like tiredness. So not only when we burnt out is the system down, like our body as a machine is it down, but the fact that we are masking it also tells different signals to the body because then it starts ignoring signs in your health. Including a lot of people do that to themselves, that they might be feeling tired and their body, their intuition would be telling them that maybe you shouldn't be going out today, maybe you shouldn't be doing so much physical work or that extra lifting in the gym or the extra run that they normally do. But we start ignoring the signs as well, which is one of the reasons why by the time a diagnosis actually happens, the disease has advanced, very quickly into the sort of higher end, and it gives a very limited window for treatment to happen. And with a lot of treatments, especially for diseases that are neurological in order, like, for example, dementia. For example, if you look at even depression and mental health, bipolar depression, we are looking at diabetes and hypertension that actually contribute to cardiovascular diseases. All these things means that people are having a huge impact on their overall quality of life. They're having a very big impact on their lifespan as well. So making sure that we go into that recovery mode from burnout is so, so, so important because, if you want good learning to happen in the classroom, I think the educators need to be really healthy to make sure that, they're not overstimulated, they're not overburdened. And that's why I work with organizations because sometimes they have to set themselves realistic, expectations in terms of not just pushing people to get things done, but pushing them, to make sure that it's realistic, for the educator to teach. It's realistic for the children to learn and have the capacity. There's no point in trying to get children to learn or educators to learn and teach at the same time when they're overstimulated and their body is just primed for survival because it will not sync. And that's when, people go into fighting mode. And after a long, period of time where you don't go into recovery, you will start experiencing health challenges. And trust me, it's not worth it, you know? So I really, really wanted to focus on this today because the good stress, the green area, when we are, for example, given a challenge, maybe if we look at something like, learning a maths problem or picking up a new language that you have to speak, those things are good stress. And that is the stuff that you really, really want, because that's when the learning happens, you know. That's when you can focus, that's when there's attention, your memory enhances, you are doing problem solving, you are doing complex thinking, building knowledge, there's motivation, there's resilience, you're getting reward as well, which is absolutely important, you know, for your emotional regulation, that people feel acknowledged, and you're able to feel that yes, you know, you've been working on something, and you got it right, you know. So that is also very, very important to stimulate, because that's how the whole cycle actually works. Now, if we disrupt this by putting you into too much of burnout and too much of stress, what happens is your memory starts failing you. And this is why it's really important, because with younger children, or children who are in sort of, you know, high school, and your brain is really, really, you know, fresh, and it's learning, that's when it's the most optimal to learn. If we are not actually stimulating the brain in the correct way later on in life, you can develop or be more likely to develop neurological diseases like dementia. You can have more challenges with the students experiencing neurodiversity because they have learning challenges, you know, autism. And this is also adding more stress onto the educators, because a lot of times now children are actually coming up, showing up as being neurodiverse. So when this happens, the educator must realize that, you know, when you're dealing with a child or a lot of children that are neurodiverse, their brain works a little bit differently in terms of how they learn. So it's very important that, you know, we're able to identify these barriers so that the teaching and the learning can actually happen. Yeah, think of it in this way, you know, if you are a medium-sized shirt and somebody tells you to try and squeeze yourself, you know, into an extra small, how would that feel? And this is the same when it comes to learning, especially with people who are neurodiverse, and even in adults and children who are not neurodiverse, but maybe they take a little bit longer to learn, you know. Not everyone, we're human beings, you know, we're not a memory stick that you can just plug in and hit the download button and everything comes in there and you've captured it in high definition. So for people to improve their performance, that learning has to be done at a pace where you are rested. And the big part of that is, you know, you do your work, you get a bit of stimulation from doing something that, you know, you're not aware of, and you learn how to achieve that, maybe learning a different language, solving a maths equation. Then you must sleep. You must step back and you must rest, because when you sleep, that's when your body makes the memories. That's when it adds everything together. And that's when the knowledge is actually built into your system. So your brain is the AI. And if you have to build it, what you have to do is you have to make sure that you have the right information, you create the right pattern, and then you sleep, so that when you're sleeping, your body can clean this up, consolidate it, make it stronger so that your learning actually lasts. That's when your memory is very good. And that's when we know that everything is working very well. The brain is really, really healthy, which means that in future, you're less likely to develop neurological diseases or neurological conditions, especially things like dementia. And you know, dementia is a very broad term, but we have things like Parkinson's disease in there. We've got Alzheimer's. You don't want to go into something where the brain starts to degenerate because you've literally overused your brain, overstressed it, you've fried your brain, and then it's miserable, because with neurodegenerative diseases, once that degeneration starts, it's very difficult for any kind of intervention to actually, you know, cut that circuit down, and the cognitive abilities start dissipating. So if you want really good cognition, like memory, problem solving, attention, focus, um, looking at making sure that, you know, you're able to process emotional information as well as, you know, thematic information, which is your information like, you know, your science and knowledge, all of those subjects, but also the more complex bits like, you know, emotions you can't really have a formula for. They're more abstract, you know, they're more subjective. So to have more balanced learning and education, this kind of stuff is really important. So you can stimulate things that are involved in those areas. For example, your prefrontal cortex here in number three, it shows that that is more active, and it's enhances your focus and your ability to plan and decision making. You know, that skill is so important in children. So they can plan their schedules and make sure that their assignments are done on time, that they're ready for the exam, and they're not asking you the last minute, what did you tell me 6 weeks ago? Because I wasn't paying attention. So those kind of things are really important, because if you stimulate them in the right time, especially with children at a young age, it's really sets them up with great cognitive skills to become really good thinkers and really good doers out there in the real
Dr.
world when
Ravi?
they finish.
Dr. Ravi?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So that this is very good. It's very good information for a teacher. What I want you to talk a little bit more. You went through this um on the surface, but if you can dive a little deeper in it, because on the right side of your screen where you have effect on the nervous system and body, we talk about short-term stress, and you mentioned that these are helpful stress because they actually they're positive stress to add to our development as human beings, not just as teachers, but human beings,
Yeah.
like in increase alertness, sharpen focus. So some of these stress are very good stress. Sharpen focus, more energy, temporary boost in performance. These stress are, it jolts us to move in the right direction. And then you have chronic stress. And I see you have here, it says harmful over time. And you
Yeah.
have nervous system stays on high alert, high blood pressure, muscle tension and pain, digestive problems, weakening immune system, poor sleep. And you mentioned you must get adequate sleep, especially deep sleep.
Yeah.
Many of our educators are people, we're not getting deep sleep. And we should be getting ourselves in that way or that level to get deep sleep. And fatigue, anxiety, and depression increase risk of chronic disease, as you mentioned. Can you talk a
Mhm.
little bit more where you tie this into, especially the chronic stress, which is harmful stress for us? Many of us in schools or in healthcare, those of us who are on here in healthcare too, we work in high stress environment. The school is very high stress. So talk a little bit how this, or we can help ourselves when we're in the school system or in high stress environment like that, where people are calling us, students are calling us. This person wants this document now. This one over here needs the paper graded and returned to them, and somebody just spills something and so on. It's high stress area. What are some of the measures that we can take in those stressful environments, even earlier in the year, so that we don't wait until the end of the year that we feel like we're really like a burnt cigar. Um,
Yeah.
how can we put measures in place so that we can, every time we're getting it to that point in any given day, we can pull ourselves back and say, okay, I need to do something like take deep breaths or take us, what can we do in that regard so that we don't reach the chronic, very, very chronic stage?
Yes, so you're right, and we did touch on this, that there are certain professions like teaching, like healthcare, where you cannot remove stress. You're constantly going to have to experience it on a daily basis. And that's why I said that, I see this across different industries. Healthcare and teaching is definitely one of them. So, what I would say is, firstly, be tuned in with yourself. How are you feeling? I'm not expecting anybody to sit there every day in classroom and daydream about how am I feeling today, but pay attention to your mood and how you feel as your day goes on. Identify what is stressing you out. You know, don't feel stress, identify what is the cause of stress. So the example you gave, somebody wanting something from you or something arriving on your desk. So figure out what is it that actually throws you off balance. Is it that, you can do two things and you can focus on two things really, really well, and you don't like having three things or four things on your table? Because if that's the case, then that means that you need to do something around your workload. You know, that maybe if you have to do, say, four things, but you can only, reasonably manage with two things, focus on that. So don't take stress as an emotion. Try and make it practical and technical so that you can tell people that, if you have something, give it to me at this time of the day, or don't disturb me at this time of the day. This is when I'll be putting all my attention into this thing, because that means, you're not being pressured. So I can completely understand that. So we'll have to draw some boundaries. Make sure that you feel and you understand when you are getting stressed and what is causing you stress, because it actually helps you tell, your colleagues, even your students, that, hey, look, come to me at this particular time, because that's when you'll be able to understand them better and actually plan it. And same thing goes with, when you have to go through that entire year, figure out which months you know that there's something due, you know that your workload is going to be high, and try and make sure that you are not taking up anything additional, additional responsibility, additional pressure, because you don't want to overload yourself. That's one thing I found people doing, that, they'll say, oh, it's okay, I'll manage, I'll do it. It works off once in a while, but don't make a habit of it. And then, of course, while you're going through that period, you have to also maintain that discipline, that, you are going to try and eat on time, you're trying to get your exercise on time, your daily routine. Try and keep as much of it as possible. I'm not necessarily telling people to do more. I'm saying that, yes, you're busy, but still try and eat healthy. Yes, you might not be getting deep sleep, but when you are getting that sleep, make sure your phone is away. You're not doom scrolling. Your phone is not going off. Put it on silent. Put a do not disturb, so that people are not knocking on your door and telling you to wake up. So just those holding those boundaries to make sure in that period of time that you stop that, input of things coming into you and landing on your inbox is very important. I think we had a question.
Yeah, I think Carrie or somebody raised their hand. Can you go ahead, please?
Hi, good afternoon or good evening. Uh, One of
Good
the things
evening.
that I find work for me that help me not to stress myself so much, each day I create a to-do list and I stick with that to-do list. So, and then
Yes.
I prioritize what comes first, what is most important and what is not so important. So I try to
Excellent.
stick to that list as best as I can. If someone comes to me and say, okay, I need this document ASAP, if it's not important, I'll say, I'll try and get it done for you as soon as I can, but I won't be able to do it now. So that whatever you have to do at the end of the day, you don't feel stressed trying to complete your task.
Excellent.
Um, Another thing that works for me, sometimes as an educator, you're in the classroom and you feel a little flustered and you just need a break. I don't see nothing wrong with it, with going to your supervisor and say, here what? Can I get a 5 minute break to revamp and then come back to the class? That works for me. So
Excellent. Excellent.
probably other persons could try that. But I know for the to-do list, it works perfectly, especially if you are having a problem with time management. It helps you a lot.
Excellent. And thank you so much for your question, and for sharing your experience, because I'm really glad that is working for you. But what I want to use as an example, as Carrie Ann just explained through what works for her, is the fact that, you are doing a to-do list, and then you're not just listing things down, you're actually then thinking about it, which is more important. So that is very important as well because, like on my chart shows, prefrontal cortex is involved in planning. So when we are experiencing stress, a lot of times people don't plan things at all because they're too tired or they're too overstimulated. But trust me, it is very important to sit down with yourself for 5 minutes and actually say, give yourself clarity. If you all keep it in your head. So some people like to write it down, some people like to do it in their head, but just do it. The exercise itself of sitting down and actually saying, what am I doing? What do I need to do? Do I really need to do this right now? That is so important because that helps you break down the stress before it actually lands on you, to stop and just have a think and take a few deep breaths. Some people like doing mindfulness. So, strategies like mindfulness, writing, all of that help, but you're not really be able to do that in the classroom, right? But in a day-to-day session, when you're teaching, planning your sessions that okay, today this is the learning objective, this is what I'm going to do, making sure that you have all the materials that you need, that this is your baseline, that this is 100% what you're going to do. Anything else outside of that is okay. If you have time, we will do it. And what is not relevant, you also need to make a list of the do's and the don't do's, that okay, I'm not going to spend more time on this, I'm not going to do this for anyone today because on my calendar, my Mondays and my Tuesdays are very important because I have to do this lesson, or whatever that is required of you. Having that workflow that you need to make for yourself is so important because that way you're breaking down the stress. You might not be getting a recovery period, but that's another very good technique. Again, you're using your prefrontal cortex, that is excellent. You're breaking down your stress. So rather than all of it hitting you at once, saying, do this, do this, do this, do this, and you're putting literally a brick on the accelerator to the finish line, you have broken it down. And now the same thing is easier to carry, and you're not going to get burnt out that way. So, do we have more questions?
I have a question. This is Gordon. The climate and culture is of paramount importance. I know we may have some educational leaders here with us. How can they set the tone
Mhm.
for the climate and culture so that stress is reduced to a minimum?
I agree. So my recommendation would be sitting down. I'm not sure how your setups would be individually, but sitting down with your teams, the teachers, your colleagues that are going through, making sure that when you have those staff meetings, that all of your concerns are communicated really, really well. So I mentioned earlier in the session that when people are often burnt out, everybody reports burnout as an emotion that, oh, I'm feeling so burnt out. And people do understand that, but try and identify, get a little bit more practical and technical, and actually tell, your employer or your manager or whoever you are communicating to, within the school who's responsible for setting out the day-to-day management, and tell them that this is what's stressing us out. So if all the teachers have a good conversation during the staff meetings, you know, have a conversation about, hey, look, we have to do all this extra marking, and they want it by this particular deadline. How are we looking for that? Do you think we will be able to do it? And if you're not, then just say that, look, okay, the deadline must be that we have to get something done by 2 weeks. Maybe tell them that, look, we can do only this much. And then get them to adjust that expectation. What normally happens is people just take it on and they just say, okay, 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 I'll do it, I'll do it. And then they keep getting all the pressure and they realize that 2 weeks have gone by and whatever that was expected with them hasn't actually happened. So actually what can happen between the front line where you're teaching in the classroom, you know how much time you're going to need to, set the exam, teach in class, mark it. You have a better idea for how much time and effort will go through versus, somebody who might not be a teacher, so making sure that your management and your school actually knows what is realistic is really important because you don't want to set, you know, your boss or whoever is higher up, if they set a target or a you know, expectation that's unrealistic, it's going to stress everyone out for all sorts of reasons. But what doesn't happen is you don't achieve anything. You know, you in trying to meet deadlines, what people often do is they compromise on the quality of work. And as I've explained, that once you're already stressed, your thinking, your creativity, all of that goes out the window anyway. So you might actually turn up on time and everyone must be happy that something got done. But if you want good quality work, tell them. And I'm always working with educators and, you know, employers who are working with teachers and telling them that you have to set, you know, set very, very realistic expectations around what your teachers can realistically do in that time. So having that conversation, making sure that they have a very good idea of alignment between, you know, what they want you to do and how much you can realistically do. So sit down and say, okay, I can do this much, you know, this is how much we can easily do. If you want anything more, then it will we have, you know, we will have to do this at another time. So try and find alignment between what their expectation is and between what you can actually practically do.
Awesome. Um, Raise your hands if you have questions or put them in the chat. And while you're doing that, I wanted to also say that I think the school climate, the classroom, the school district or whatever the case might be, need to be very intentional about social emotional learning. It needs to become a part of the culture where mindfulness is really practiced at every level. Administrators and teachers need to understand what mindfulness is. That self-reflection and that, you know, looking at your situation without judging without judgment,
Mm,
and also because it's reciprocates. If stress goes out there, then stress is going to be reciprocated to you. But if you can create an environment where
yeah.
you try to be proactive, and that proactive approach, I think also is very important.
Absolutely. And one of the things I recommend educators to do, because, you know, children spend so much time with teachers, right? And the climate actually really matters because if the child is scared of learning, you know, they are not going to engage very well with the teacher, and the teacher is going to find it very, very hard to teach anything to the child.
Right.
And this happens because, you know, when you have big classrooms of maybe 30 children, 28 children, 25 children, you get different personalities. You know, some are really good, some are very, very, you know, in their own world. Some need a lot more attention, some want a lot more attention. So you're always going to be pulled apart in the classroom. So what I really, really recommend for teachers to do is, you know, we all understand how it can feel as an adult when you go into a classroom where, you know, there's just chaos and the kids are not listening, and you have to try and make sure that you can get your work done, but the children are all, you know, energetic, or, you know, there might be things going on. Is to try and build that relationship with the children, you know, with your class, because they spend a lot of time with you. That really matters, because if that trust actually happens, that social learning is so much easier rather than sitting down and trying to say, you have to learn this maths equation. Whereas if the understanding between the two people, there's comfort, even if they might not like maths, or they might find that this is really, really hard and it's scaring them out, you know, or they're going into overthinking that I'm not good at this, I'm going to have a very bad mark on the exam, then at least the fact that you are comfortable, you can actually sit down with them and they can actually tell you what they find hard, and you can actually help them learn a little bit better. And how this actually works is your prefrontal cortex. You know, if we look at my screen, point number 3 shows the prefrontal cortex. That's where all your social learning happens. So that's the temples, you know, that area of your brain. That's where your social learning happens. That's when your decision making happens. We have something called mirror neurons, and that's exactly what the name says. They replicate what the other person throw to you. So when you are looking at people and you're speaking to them, because you have these mirror neurons, you're able to mirror their emotions. So if somebody nods at you, you'll nod back at them. And we do this very, very involuntarily. So our biology is there for social learning. I know that in many cultures, or I think few generations ago, there was a lot of fear that was used for learning, and that created a lot of trauma in children because they didn't want to learn because they were so scared of failing. There was a lot of social pressure from family, from relatives, from parents, from friends for who's going to be the smartest and what this means for your future. So I always find that educators struggle in the classroom because they're dealing with children, who have these pressures as well. So my first recommendation for an educator would be try and be friends with your students so that they can come to you if they are stuck, and they can actually help you teach them better and tell them that you are there to help them learn, but they also need to help you so you can teach them. So it's a peer related kind of a relationship between the student and the teacher. It's less of a master servant relationship, because we don't want to drive fear in the students. The minute they start feeling fear and anxiety, and there's so many things happening, with social media pressure. It's not just the children in the classroom, it's the phones in the classroom, making sure that they're paying attention, but also, the bullying. Um, Sometimes there's a bit of the child, when they're not able to learn things, they disengage, or they try and find excuses for not doing it, and it gets really hard for the teacher to then try and keep the lesson going. So try from the very beginning to tell your students that yes, I'm your educator, there's a respect, but we need to respect each other and help each other learn, because if they're stressing you out, you will not be able to teach them very well, and it's going to impact the learning for the whole classroom. But at the same time, if they're struggling and they're not telling you, then it makes it very difficult to you, because in your mind, you have planned a beautiful lesson and you've come up and you've done your teaching. But because the child is, feeling anxious, or they might feel anxiety around performance or failure or self-worth, self-doubt, those kind of things, that lesson isn't going to land with them. So having that relationship, investing in that relationship with your children is going to be so important to make sure that learning is easy for both of you.
Do we have any more questions? We wanted to give an opportunity. If you don't have a question and you have a comment, we saw a couple of comments in the chat. Uh, does anyone have a, let me see here. Someone says, the to-do list also works very well for me in making a weekly plan for tasks. And this person said they do it on Sunday evenings. Another person
Fantastic.
says, another person says, or in diverse classrooms, sometimes we have to leave the lesson, sometimes to deal with social issues and family matters. And that is mindfulness. That is
Mhm.
mindfulness. Uh, Another person says, so we need to involve the community, the family, and the classroom in order to achieve. And then we have, I'm just two more to go. One says, setting non-negotiable boundaries. Be aware or be conscious of the limit of what you can reasonably do. Do not try to be a hero or a savior. My superintendent said that to me one time. Noel, you can't save everybody. This person also says, have a stress sink, an activity, not a vice, that disconnects you from school and feels fulfilling. These are powerful pointers. And another person also, well, this is a question. Is there a self assessment quiz one can take to detect our presence, to detect the presence of burnout? This is a question for you, Dr. Ravi. It says, is there a self assessment quiz one can take to detect the presence of burnout?
No, and that's actually the challenge I have, because burnout is so subjective, right? And for a very long time, it was kind of thought that, if somebody says that they're burnt out, there was, in an organizational level, there was this assumption that, that person might not be capable or be less capable. What we're seeing now is that the way we work, we're kind of being conditioned to work as machines, but the reality is we're humans. you know. We need certain times. We cannot function like a manufacturing unit where, you know, you have arms and mechanisms and you push buttons and it just goes and does things, you know, because those are simple tasks. In a classroom environment, you know, I'm so glad to get all of your questions because I really, really wanted that, you know, you were able to gain something out of today's session, that, you know, you all are aware of the fact that, yes, you do need to be mindful of what's happening in the class and step outside, because that's not just part of your, you know, learning, you know, teaching the lesson. It's actually teaching other things to children, like, for example, around bullying, around, you know, not judging other students so that there's no pressure in the classroom, you know. And you get so many children that come from different backgrounds, you know. Some come from very humble backgrounds, some come from, you know, some children have personalities, you know, when they're very, very young and they're, you know, watching so many things these days, you know, exposed to different things. So children are very easy to pick up on different attitudes and behaviors. It can get incredibly challenging. So I would say communicate with your team, you know, whether it's your parents, whether it's the school, and actually tell them that, you know, if there is a particular situation with, you know, your cohort, that you can actually raise awareness and actually sit down with the parents as well sometimes to say that, look, I have noticed I'm giving the lesson, but, you know, your child has maybe a lot of anxiety, or maybe they might get a little bit stressed. So try and make sure that the child can actually get that support from home as well, that encouragement, because like I said, a few generations ago, learning was very much pressured onto children. And I think we've all been there as children where, you know, growing up, it was like, oh my God, you got to do this, you know? And that has actually conditioned us to stay in stress. And we're not enjoying learning because we've already been kind of primed that this is horrible, this is hard. And if you can't do it, then, you know, all hell will break loose. The world's going to come to an end. You know,
Mhm.
doomsday is going to happen. We don't want that in our children because, believe it or not, how you teach them is what's actually going to stay with them for life. You know, the fact that there was an educator that's, you know, stuck with them and believed in them and encouraged them in their abilities, even if you have a child that might not be, you know, developing at a faster rate as everybody else, because these things really matter. It sets up the child for their behavior, for their social learning that actually comes across in you know, later life. So if you want good human beings, not just, you know, academically brilliant students, we really need to make sure that the child and this teacher, they're all in sync together. So having those boundaries and, you know, being the boss of the classroom is something that I absolutely recommend, that, you know, I really want the educators to feel engaged and be in command of how they're actually going to leading this, because you're with the children, right? You know best who's learning fast, who's learning slow, you know, and you will pick this up very quickly. So trust that instinct. If your school is saying that, no, I want this done in this particular time, well, you know, you have to tell them that, well, hang on, we know realistically how long this is going to take. So try and find that alignment, because it's kind of like stakeholder management. You have to make sure the child, your you know, your employer, your boss, as well as the parents, all of us are a team. So it is a community effort.
Wonderful. I know time is of the essence, and we're going to be closing out, but we have a few comments that I'd like to read them. They're coming in now that we're getting towards the end. One person says, I think that's Michelle, says that the teaching profession has become so overwhelming that we do more administrative duties than teaching. Another person says, your body lets, that's Lorna. Lorna says, your body lets you know when you are approaching a burnout. That's true. And she says, so you know when it's time to step back and take a breather. We know, but not everybody step back, even though you're supposed to know that you're supposed to step back. And then Tasha said, sometimes we have to stop the classroom uh, teaching of structured lesson and step outside and teach other social aspects of life. Teach them how to socialize with each other and respect everyone's way of life and feeling. Carrion, well, These are just names. Okay. All right. So I think that's what we have for now. Thank you so much. Do you have any closing remarks before we close out, Dr. Ravi?
I just want to say thank you so much. I know it has been a very long day, but I genuinely appreciate everybody turning up today after their, very busy schedules and take out this evening for this workshop. I certainly have enjoyed it, and I definitely appreciated everybody's, comments and their engagement, their questions, because I really feel educators are very powerful. It's more than the lesson that they teach that it's the children that they actually raise that become more responsible adults for the future. So I think the job is amazing. It's fantastic. And from my end, I would really appreciate, and that's why I work with organizations, making sure that they work with their educators rather than against them, so there shouldn't be any friction. So thank you all so much. Thank you for having me. And I hope that you'd be able to pick up something about burnout so you can, find that alignment, with your children, with your, schools, to make teaching more enjoyable.
Dr. Ravi, thank you. Have done an excellent job. You're just a natural for this, and we really appreciate the fact that this is Thursday in New Zealand, right? You're in New Zealand?
Yes.
Yeah, New Zealand. Thursday in New Zealand, Wednesday in the United States and the Western world here. And we thank you so much, and we do not take this for granted. We're looking forward to having more sessions with you for sure.